our Managing Director from Taylor and Francis Asia Pacific, Barry Clark, who will begin with the welcome remarks, followed by the opening remarks by Rommel A. Gurming, introduction by the editor of the book, Nasif, and there'll be a panel discussion with three speakers, chaired by editor Francis Antinoid Cruz. There'll be a Q&A session where you may pose your questions in the chat box, and we will get to them one by one. Closing remarks by Aigu, and then we will also share a discount code for this book, which is valid for 3 months. And so now, without further ado, I would like to pass the time over to our Managing Director from Taylor and Francis Asia Pacific, Barry Clark. Barry, when you're ready.
Yes, thank you, Christy. Yes, hello, my name is Barry Clark. I'm Managing Director for Taylor and Francis here in Singapore. Like everybody, I'm working from home at the moment. But the wonders of technology means that we can have a virtual book launch with people gathered from all over Southeast and even East Asia. So welcome to this virtual book launch. In fact, today is a day for 3 celebrations. One, of course, is celebrating the book launch, the book International Studies in the Philippines, Mapping New Frontiers in Theory and Practice. Congratulations to the authors, and I'll be handing on to Rommel in a moment, but it's always wonderful to see a new book come onto the market, and this book is particularly important, I believe. The second celebration is because today happens to be the birthday of Jasmine, our sales manager for the Philippines, and I know Jasmine is on the line. I'm not going to embarrass her by asking her to come on the line, but happy birthday, Jasmine. Thirdly, it's a celebration because today I happened to finish a book, and actually rather related to this theme. The book is by Syed Hussein Alatas, Thomas Stamford Raffles, Schemer or Reformer. I'm a great fan of Syed Hussein Alatas, and I read The Myth of the Lazy Native a good few years ago, published by Routledge. Of course, Syed Hussein Alatas was one of the first thinkers to challenge ways of looking at the world, challenging the usual colonial narratives, perhaps from a sociological point of view in his case, but also international relations and politics. So it is really a coincidence that I finished that book today. The answer to the question, was Raffles a schemer or a reformer? We all now know he was indeed a schemer. And perhaps on that note, I'd love to pass the mic on to Rommel and to make his opening remarks. So Rommel in Brunei, over to you.
Thank you very much, Barry. Oh, good afternoon, everyone. I wish to thank everyone who joined us here. I wish to thank you for taking time to be with us. So as Barry mentioned, this is a celebration. And other than what he mentioned as, I think this is a celebration of the passion of scholarship, in particular for the rethinking of the field of international studies. So I'd like to thank the leadership of PISO for this opportunity to say a few words about this momentous occasion. So since 5 years ago, when Nasif invited me to be part of PISO as one of its consultants or members of the board, I have been closely watching and been honestly amazed at the various initiatives and growth of this organization. To be honest, initially I was rather doubtful about its viability. I knew that the culture in the academia that tends to be inimical to youthful initiatives and intellectual exuberance. And I also knew about the paternalistic dominance of old guards in IR, IS, political science in the Philippines and the region more broadly. One would be hard-pressed to find an academic organization in the region in various social science and humanistic disciplines that are spearheaded and run by youngish, or young aspiring academics. Practically all of these organizations are lorded over by big names in the old guards in the field. I thank God that my initial doubts were disproven. The coming out of the book we're launching today, International Studies in the Philippines, is yet the latest in the strings of PISO's remarkable achievements in the past 2 years. But beyond the confine of PISO as an organization, what is truly remarkable in this book is the intervention. It contributes in the effort to rethink the very idea of the international. Long trapped in the restricted and conventional notion of power, as well as the taken for granted state-centric level of analysis. International relations, international studies has long run the risk of being no more than a justification, even an apology for analysis that serves the interests of the elites and the already powerful. If we are interested in a critical or emancipatory international studies, it entails opening up or widening or rethinking of the very notion of international. And towards this end, this book is definitely a worthy contribution. Kudos to the editors, Nassef and Francis, as well as the contributors to the book, and also to Taylor and Francis Group, Routledge, for allowing a book like this to be published. Thank you very much, and I pass you on to Nassef for the introduction.
Thank you, everyone. Can everybody hear me? Hello?
Yes,
Yes.
can hear you.
Yes.
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, for attending the first Routledge virtual book launch on international studies in the Philippines, mapping new frontiers in theory and practice. This is indeed a result of several academic activities that the FISO had organized since June 2016 until early 2019 as part of the launching titles of the International Relations in Southeast Asia series published by Routledge and the flagship series of FISO. We have had workshops, panels, and forums organized by FISO, notably held in conjunction with ISA, the International Studies Association, and WISC, the World International Studies Committee. We're very grateful for WISC for providing us the workshop grant, which was held in Cebu and was exquisitely done and headed by one of our presenters today, Assistant Professor Archel Capistran of UP Cebu. We're also thankful with our partners who accommodated FISO activities throughout these years, namely International Studies departments in FEU headed by Assistant Professor Francis Esteban, in Ateneo de Davao University headed by Assistant Professor John Harvey Gomez, and in Miriam College headed by Assistant Professor Melanie Reyes. Towards the journey of creating this book, we were asked questions about what made the Philippines unique for the purposes of understanding the international, and in what form we would engage with the extant canon of international relations scholarship. The first question thus deserves some scrutiny and deep reflection. It is somewhat true that our origins were dominated by European and American-based institutions, journals, and foundations, often state-funded or created by independent institutions to study global events. Now, in contrast, the Philippines, at least from the perspective of the nation state, has not fostered a similar sense of international crisis as it appears marginal and changing the dynamics and status quo of the existing international system, mainly receiving international attention because of major natural disasters, calamities, terrorism, and more poverty. The experience of colonialism left several legacies with various consequences for social, economic, and political order that provide rich material for the study of accommodations of Western modernity amidst independent statehood. continuities, for instance, in terms of the powerful role of elite families that may frustrate institutional power, the adoption of Christianity as a yardstick for moral and cultural development, colonial era prejudices that have informed subjectivities in the country, colonial statecraft, an American style compartmentalized educational system, and cultural affinities that tend to lean toward countries in Latin America have shaped what a few have previously called the maverick reputation of the Philippines in the region. The manner in which the discipline of international relations is viewed, structured, and imparted is inevitably the result of a negotiation accompanying its introduction into specific context and the discipline's subsequent modes of articulation, or as Hamati Ataya elaborates, in areas such as Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, and parts of Asia, academic marginalizations is more problematic as it results from a combined cultural and institutional dependence that is often the product of enduring colonial structures clashing with local concerns and aspirations. The mismatch between local cultural knowledge and an American based education have led the statist Philippines to marginalize attempts at critical innovation, and that the country has continued to imitate the Western privileging of positivist based knowledge claims and industry oriented pedagogy. The ensuing pedagogy of IR as a result of this transformative process informs the transmission of national historical memory, the framing of national foreign policy, and the selection of relevant schools of thought. The formative years of teaching international relations in the Philippines are documented in Agbala's appraisal of the state of political science in the country and demonstrate the shared general frustrations of academics working in global South conditions with increased workload, little funding, or few opportunities to travel, and a general disinterest in research, which have often been cited as contributing to the lack of visible participation of non-Western academics in knowledge production in IR. Nevertheless, despite challenging conditions, there are a number of publication avenues for research in IR. Local journals such as Kasarinlan, Asia Pacific Social Science Review, Philippine Political Science Journal, Public Policy and Asian Studies allow for the dissemination of knowledge and academic discussion on topics concerning the international, while an estimated 27 undergraduate and 9 graduate programs are offered in international studies, international relations, diplomacy, foreign service, and global studies, among other related program titles across the country. However, most of these programs continue and reinforce Western narratives of mainstream theoretical dramas. The desire for the development of Philippine IR does not necessarily translate into including local scholarship at the undergraduate level, since most, if not all, the works, programs, and educational trainings are Western dominated. It is rather a challenge to map and locate Philippine IR. These critically pose a practical pedagogical challenge as to how expectations of curricula designed in a Western or U.S. framework are to be combined with the desire to incorporate local experiences when teaching the international. Critical space for thinking outside the box, for multi-perspective exploration, and for consideration of lived experiences and of local philosophies or schools of thought are not institutionalized components of IS curricula and are only disparately introduced through possibilities created by area studies or an IS professor's own initiative, tracing the development of IR as an epistemic space that is at the intersection of pedagogy, practice, policy, and research, thereby has the potential to reveal not only discontinuities and continuities from hegemonic and textbook narratives of IR's development as a field, but also to discover lines of local and regional alignments of thought. A diachronic perspective supports the view that the Philippines is rife grounds for research on coexistence, difference, interaction, combination, and dialectal change, which characterize the condition of the international and the creation of multiple modernities. While this book does not forward a specific theory of Philippine IR, it aims to remain cognizant of the diverse ways in which the positionality of the Philippines informs the exercise and contestation of agency and knowledge production in the realm of international. The volume comprises two parts, which represent a collection of essays on potential sources of knowledge production and emerging practices derived from the situating of the Philippines in the international. It reveals various theoretical positions that intersect with dominant paradigms in IR without eschewing the same. Many are eclectic, representing interdisciplinary scholarship that draws heavily from historical sources, textual references, archaeological findings, and local concepts, values, and interests that are implicitly incorporated into practices or appropriated by civil and political actors. I urge everyone to purchase the book. It will really help as you think about the idea, notion, practice, and study of the international. Even after the panel presentation, you may pose your questions to any of the authors since most of them are present here. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Nasif. And we will now be proceeding to the panel discussion chaired by the editor Francis Antenoid Cruz. So I'll be playing a series of videos. The first speaker would be Dr. Alan Chong. Please give me a minute while I put that video on.
All right. I'll introduce Alan Chong briefly to everyone.
Sure.
Alan Chong is Associate Professor and Acting Head of the Center for Multilateralism Studies at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore. He has published widely on the notion of soft power and the role of ideas in constructing Asian international relations. So he's here right now to tell us a bit about his chapter, well, in video form at least, because unfortunately he couldn't attend today. Jose Rizal attacks imperialism softly, comprehending the depths of psychological conversion and the temptations of violent solutions.
Thank you. All right, so I'll be sharing the video right now.
Christy, I think the sound is not working.
Just give me a minute, I'll reshare this.
Okay.
Okay, is it fine now?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm
Yes,
Alan Chong, the
good.
author of the chapter titled Jose Rizal Attacks Imperialism Softly. Before I get into the chapter proper, to give you some insights, I'd like to congratulate Nasef and Frankie for putting this book together. It's a lot of work, I know, for an edited volume, but this is a milestone publication to me, because it brings me back to the days when I edited what was probably the first special issue in an academic journal looking at the historiography and sociology of teaching international politics in Southeast Asia. This was the famous Chong and Hamilton Hart special issue of 2009. Now, we had almost all the original ASEAN 5 almost countries represented in terms of country surveys of what went into influencing the teaching of IR in these countries. And one gap, huge gap to me, was the Philippines. Partly because I think we approached more senior academics on the Philippines who thought that this was too fluffy to merit significant academic investment of time and effort to do research into what influenced, the making of particular syllabi for IR in the Philippines. But there's so much of discovery if you actually do that. And I'm glad that international studies in the Philippines is finally, addressing this issue. And this is truly the awakening of the Asia Pacific, or Indo-Pacific if you prefer, because we need to know how we teach IR and how we are shaping the minds of present and future generations, all right, in terms of how they understand the international. So it is as much about roots, your own roots, the roots of all Asians, the roots of trans-Asia, okay, and I'm glad this volume tries to speak beyond just the Philippines, although it has to focus definitely, given its title, on the Philippines itself. Secondly, I also want to congratulate both editors for, in a sense, showing that this is an attempt at critical theory, all right? Now, when I teach critical theory, I've often had to apologize to my audience to say that, more than 50% of the authors in a course like that, like a critical theory in IR, has to be Western. I don't want to continue apologizing like this forever. And I'm glad that many of the selections represented in this book actually burnish these credentials. There is critical IR thinking from Asia, especially in this case, Philippines. All right. Now, my chapter, without going deep into my intellectual journey of discovery of Jose Rizal's political thought, it suffices to say that I was influenced by a number of Filipino friends, including the present company in this book, to actually explore what Jose Rizal's political thought meant in terms of this wider Asian mosaic of decolonization. All right. And I've deliberately given this strange title because Jose Rizal is not an easy read. Now, Asia suffered massively from colonialism. And as I've highlighted in the chapter, imperialism / colonialism fundamentally is an exploitative political and economic scheme. And in the course of this exploitation, it leaves a lot of mental, psychological, if you prefer, intellectual scars that are with us today. And I always, get this hair-raising moment when foreign commentators, especially those from the West, keep saying that certain Asian political systems and the elites do not have the confidence, okay, to run a nation state. This is a terrible indictment that echoes from the colonial days, all right? So the beauty of Rizal's thought is that he calls attention to the fact that this violence that the colonial authorities perpetrated to consolidate the colonial order in places like the Philippines meant that you have to degrade the dignity of the local inhabitants, the natives, all right, in all manner. It's not just in terms of economic discrimination, political discrimination. It is also about the deliberate miseducation, something which another chapter, I believe it's by Erickson Kalata, picks up on. This miseducation of the local people, just so that they are not given any inspiration to revolt against the colonial order. And finally, I think Jose Rizal is a wonderful political thinker to read because he addresses this question of the dilemmas of using political violence I know some of you will say this veers somewhat away from the familiar understanding of the international. But this is what Rizal is saying to us. Okay, and I haven't had the space, all right, and I know Florence Kibuyen's criticism of my earlier video on YouTube, where I introduced my chapter as well, that, you know, she thinks that Rizal resolved this dilemma about using political violence, whereas my reading purely of Rizal's two big novels, Noli Me Tangere and Alfred Usterismo, suggests that this dilemma is deliberately left there to stand in both novels. Why? The colonials used violence to degrade the dignity of the native inhabitants and to perpetrate violence through miseducation. When we, the natives, the Asians, take over the colonial state and give ourselves the label post-colonial, are we above resorting to those same, you know, evil, between inverted commas, methods of violence? All right. If you look across Asia today, the record is not completely reassuring. Neither is it completely pessimistic. There are strands of hope when we read, okay, some of our nationalist forebears, okay, like Jose Rizal. He argues that violence is everywhere in politics. And in both novels, again, you have to read the chapter to look at the fine detail, is widely available to both the subjugated as well as the superiors, the colonial superiors, and even the church, okay, the imported Spanish Catholic Church was riddled with temptations towards violence. And it was the mission of Rizal, as far as I can discern it from the two novels, to disabuse his readers of the fact that, you know, you need to counter violence with violence. That seems to be the nationalist narrative across much of Asia. But in Rizal's writings, insofar I've discerned it strictly from his two huge novels, it is a warning not just to his fellow compatriots that you have to be careful about using violence, because you're going to leave this temptation to use it again and again to the point where it debases your original political ideals. All right. So I think the beauty about Rizal attacking imperialism softly in this dilemmatic manner, meaning it's full of dilemmas at every level, is that invite us to think about what it means to be modern Asia today. Have we gone past the idea that violence has to be constitutionalized so that when the people misbehave, we take it out like a whip, okay, or like a rod of punishment to discipline the masses? And then if you do that, you have to bear in mind, was this not the way your recent colonial masters did it as well? And in that sense, are you no better? All right, I leave this as food for thought for you. And I hope that you're sufficiently tempted by what I've said in terms of drawing attention to this social dimension of international relations to read my chapter. And of course, I welcome criticisms, feedback, and so on. Thank you.
All right. Before we start the Q&A, we have two more presentations. The next speaker is Archil Nina Capistrano, Assistant Professor at the University of the Philippines, Cebu, Chairperson of the Board of Trustees of the NGO Children's Legal Bureau, Inc., and Visayas Lead Representative of the Philippine International Studies Organization. Her research interests include liquid modernity and human trafficking in IR, which are the focus of her chapter, Sexploitative Human Trafficking in, Out of, and Beyond the Philippines, a Liquid Problem in a Cosmopolar International System.
Thank you. I'll just share the video right now.
reality in writing this chapter A core reality in writing this chapter of the book is that the Philippines has become the epicenter of commercialized sexual abuse online, with practically 80% of our posterity at risk. Hello everyone, I am Arch Capistrano of the University of the Philippines, Cebu, author of this book's Chapter 13 entitled Sexploitative Human Trafficking in, Out, and Beyond the Philippines, a Liquid Problem in a Cosmopolar International System. As of this presentation, the Philippines continues to hold for 5 straight years the Tier 1 status in the latest 2020 Trafficking in Persons report issued by the U.S. State Department, a status that means full compliance of the minimum standards not of the UN Anti-Trafficking in Persons Protocol, but the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of the US that openly declares this compliance report as a diplomatic tool for aid giving. This annual report is educative of mainstream anti-trafficking efforts that adhere mainly to the criminalization frame. Yet, there are other frames to view trafficking in persons, alternative frames that elicit a different take on how to address this global issue. This chapter will describe them to you as it argues that sexploitative human trafficking is a liquid problem in the international system, a globalized cosmos characterized by polarities of hybrid forms and locations of power. As a defining specimen in the study of politics and international relations, power is typically understood as the ability to make someone do something that he or she would not otherwise do. In this chapter, I focus on a different form of power, the power to move, or mobility. After all, mobility facilitates globality, or cosmopolitan experiences for some, even as it endangers others in terms of displacement and, yes, victimization to non-traditional security concerns that include human trafficking. We relate mobility to what globalization literature refers to as flows, flows of capital, ideas, technology, peoples, or as what complexity theory stalwart John Urey calls global fluids. This cosmobility of global fluids tends to challenge the solidity of nation-state borders in uncanny ways. Thus, from the solid face of modernity, I employ the concept of liquid modernity by Polish sociologist Zygmunt Bauman. In my interview about this chapter of the book for the Philippine International Studies Organization, I disclosed then, as I do so now, that I made an intellectual appropriation of this concept of liquid modernity from its typical application in terrorism studies, by which terrorists are viewed as global fluids. The more you make a solid grasp of them, the easier they slip away, and can engage and disengage at will, pretty much like the non-traditional security issues, including pandemic-inducing viruses like the SARS-CoV-2 that is giving us COVID right now. Typical solutions? Regulate or prohibit mobility. In the case of human trafficking, certain mobilities tend to be more free than others, depending on the power bearer. Bauman refers to those with empowered mobility as tourists. And in my research, sex tourists tend to come from the global north. Yet, at the flip side of the ability to move is vulnerability, as typified by vagabonds, whose typically challenged conditions induce them forced mobility. And they tend to come from the global south. An example, our very own exportable labor that the Philippine government consents to in anticipation of hard currency from overseas Filipino workers' remittances. Consequently, the locus of most anti-trafficking efforts are concentrated in the supply side, usually by stemming the tide of migration or unwanted mobility, pretty much like quarantines and lockdowns. This way, the structures of solid modernity get to reassert themselves. But my chapter questions, why so much fuss on the supply side? What about the other end of the pole? From this cosmopolarity, and inspired by my work not only in the academe, but with civil society groups, particularly the Children's Legal Bureau, I inquire whether or not there are enough efforts by the powerful to curb the demand for sex that in the first place fuels sex tourism and sexploitative human trafficking. Are these efforts fluid enough to address this liquid problem? More interestingly, are there efforts by other non-state actors that reconfigure vulnerability into power? Read the chapter to find out. Buy our book. A core reality.
Okay, we'll move on to the last presentation for the panel discussion.
All right. Our last presenter is Dr. Amador Peleo, independent researcher, who'll talk about the conclusion of the book, Small Statism and the Non-Issue of IR in the Philippines.
Greater power. Hello. I have been asked to speak about my paper without being too academic about it. It's the last chapter in the book, so there's a summary of the previous chapters. But I thought it would be interesting to add something that wasn't just a retelling of the previous ideas. Maybe I could even have found some unifying idea. As I read those other papers, I got the distinct impression that those other papers were based on a distinct idea of international relations. Conventionally, international relations are about a discursive form of interaction between peoples of different nationalities. That's another way of saying that I can have other people of different nationalities understand that I have my interests, just as they can have me understand that they have their interests. Now, a perfect understanding isn't always possible, and there is always the possibility of a conflict of interest. The point is that a discursive or conversational form of interaction is at the core of international relations. The goal is to resolve confrontation with conversation. Now, these other papers seem to be based on the idea that international relations is driven mainly by assertions of national identity. That's another way of saying that most people are concerned with forming relations with those they consider similar. Similar languages, similar passports, similar ethnicities, similar histories, whilst keeping a safe distance away from those they consider different. It's as if beyond the national borders live dangerous foreigners who will exploit us if given the chance. Now, given this suspicion, conflict is practically inevitable, and under those conditions, confrontation rather than conversation is the norm. The reason for this outlook is clear to those who know Philippine political history. Filipinos are well schooled about the awfulness of their colonial and post-colonial past. It's not that Filipinos are particularly aggressive to non-Filipinos. It's just that there's a form of defiance that is inherent in their national identity. Even the national anthem celebrates the death of the martyr at the hands of invaders and oppressors, all of which are foreign. But there's another reason to this outlook. Filipinos think that because a social hierarchy exists in their state, that a similar social hierarchy must exist between states. Most Filipinos accept the reality that their lives are dominated by a wealthy and powerful elite. These same Filipinos are willing to accept the relative weakness of their state, so long as this domination by elite states is not too harsh or obvious. To explain this outlook, I use the concept of small statism as a framing device. It was not developed with the Philippines specifically as a reference, but it is useful because it helps to show that the Philippine state, with all its troubles, is not unique in this world. The version that I am using was derived from the work of Jean A.K. Hay and of James Rosenau. A small state will have several characteristics. First, a government that does not intend to become a regional, global, or great power. Second, a society that is struggling with forms of social hierarchy and control. And third, relations with other small states that are themselves heavily influenced by states with greater power. The behavior of people who live in these small states will also have certain characteristics. First, a lingering ambivalence or mixed feelings about their forms of life that are very heavily influenced by outsiders. Second, an alignment with foreign ideas that are nonetheless presented as universally true. And third, a kind of indecisiveness when the influence of a foreign state wanes. That is, local people will not immediately realign themselves with a substitute dominant state. So, people who live in small states appear to be caught in a bind. Their societies are so divided that they are not able to successfully resist the influence of powerful states. But these divisions have existed for so long and have become so wide that the local people already identify themselves with these divisions. Let me put it differently. In my other research on Philippine politics and security, I've found that Filipinos are more than willing to fight each other over ideas they did not originally think, with weapons they did not make, for the approval of persons they will probably never meet, and all the while thinking that all they are doing is just being themselves. Here is another insight. Government officials in small states typically find themselves between foreigners who would want access to the local population and the local population that would like to have the things that foreigners provide. In the Philippines at least, government officials like to portray themselves as patrons who work for the benefit of the local loyal client population. A foreigner that was able to set up local operations might not have seen anything except a series of official-looking transactions. But from a local perspective, what has actually happened is that a local politician has allowed something to exist that the local population would not have been able to provide for themselves. The foreigner has become the tool by which the patron politician keeps the local population loyal and under control. Corruption may or may not have happened in the process. The point is that even a broad range of foreign products, services, and ideas might yet be channeled into the narrow agendas of the local small state politician. I'll summarize the paper like this. Filipinos don't feel as if they're able to significantly influence the international. They probably feel that the most they can do is cope with the changes as they occur. But I don't think the smallness of a state is necessarily a problem. That's because the oppression of the small must always be seen with the oppressiveness of the large. These days, small states and great power states are vulnerable to the same sort of threats. So, skills in governance and diplomacy are just as important, or probably even more important, than size of state budgets and militaries. In other words, Being small in the international isn't necessarily a problem, but being small-minded definitely is.
All right, I think we can move on to the question and answer part of this book launch. I'll be taking questions. You may also address them in the chat box, or you may turn on your microphone if you have a question. Most of the authors are here, so there were a few people who have had access to this book and maybe would like to ask a few questions. We currently have one question in the chat box. It's about, I'm not sure if it's related to human trafficking directly. It's about, I think, porn sites in the Philippines being allowed, even though it's not legal. Perhaps you'd like to elaborate, Mr. Domar Alviar? Even though it is not legal in the Philippines. So I think Archil is here. Archil, would you like to respond, or maybe Mr. Alviar would like to clarify the question?
Yes, all right. But in case, I would probably yield first to the one who asks the question in case there is a further clarification.
Is Mr. Alviar here?
Okay, probably I'll just answer it according to what we see or on its face. So definitely child pornography, it's in my chapter actually, that it's one of the crimes that are addressed by existing legislation. We have the Child Pornography Act. So it is definitely not allowed in the Philippines, but operating internet and internet cafes, for as long as you're able to present legitimate papers for your business, then you could. The only thing is there will always be these situations and connections that are not easily regulated, and one of them are those in the dark web, for example, and that also includes the porn sites. So these are things that's why I was talking about earlier the concept of global fluids. The internet is a global fluid. It is difficult to regulate, so the more you grasp it, the more it slips away. That's why I was advocating for more fluid solutions, not just solid or state-centric solutions, but more creative solutions. In the NGO community, we engage with the 5 pillars of justice. So that would include not only government agents and government agencies, but also the communities, because ultimately there is only so much the government can do. We need a concerted effort to address a fluid or liquid problem such as human trafficking and even online child sex exploitation. Thank you.
All right. Mr. Alviar, I hope that answers your questions. We're still open here in the chat box in case anyone would like to ask a question of any of the authors or editors of the book. You may also turn on your mic alternatively if you have a question or comment. Perhaps I'd like to also, while you're thinking of the questions, acknowledge the presence of the authors and some of the book series editors. So this is part of a book series called International Relations in Southeast Asia, and some of the series editors are present. For example, Dr. Eigel is here. She'll be doing the closing remarks. And we have many of the authors of the book who are also present in today's chat, such as Adonis Alumbre is here. We have Alia Peleo is also here, Brian Dose. Let me see. We have Nasif, he's one of the editors. We have Eric Calata, Alia Peleo, series editor Dr. Romel Curaming, Harvey Gamas, who wrote the first chapter, John Raymond Tison, who wrote one of the Praxis chapters. And we have Patrick Bogarin, And I'm sorry if I'm missing anyone. Ricardo Lopez, in case you would like to address any of your questions to them. All right. Any questions? Look at the chat. Okay. Barry Clark has a question. Is there any structured attempt to decolonize the curriculum in the Philippines? I think that anyone can, I think any of the authors can speak. Maybe Nasif, would you like to answer this question first? And then if you'd like to join, or Nasif, would you like to answer the question?
Hi, Barry. Thank you for the question. There is not so much massive decolonization or decolonial attempt to decolonize curriculum in the Philippines, whether in its structure, contents, and other forms of the curriculum. But the instructor or the professor has the freedom to obtain materials that would introduce the students to decolonial thinking and doing. So it is up to the professor or the one who designed the curriculum to include references or materials that may be used for the students to be oriented with decolonial materials that is rooted to the structural norms, cultures, and conceptualizations more, I would say, friendly to Philippines and even to pre-colonial understanding of the Philippines.
If I may just add, I do think that when we wrote about this in the introduction, that a lot of the paradigms that are used within the Philippines and Southeast Asia, particularly in international relations, are either constructivism and realism. In the TRIP survey that we conducted in the Philippines, it was liberalism came out, although the N was quite small. It was around 43 people who took part in the survey who are involved in various aspects of teaching international relations. Although I would say that there are certain areas where decolonizing the curriculum is present, not necessarily in IR, perhaps in area studies, the humanities, Philippine studies. So you have a lot of things going on in these fields. And the book tries to look at their intersections with international relations and some of the ideas that are proffered in the study of the international. So you'll see a lot of these attempts in the book, although they do occur elsewhere. So one of the chapter that I wrote is a bit about looking at and trying to map these connections using journal articles, particularly when talking about the international. However, I do believe, Nasif, that we did read an article before about the state of post-colonial and decolonial studies in Southeast Asia, right? Although Alan Chung did mention that there are a lot of conversations going on about Trans-Asia. There's also Inter-Asia from cultural studies. So there is a lot of that happening in various corners of the academe, whether or not it's a concerted attempt to decolonize and also decolonize veering away from the rhetoric of nationalism, for example, is less clear, or let's say not really concerted in the sense that there is a coordinated effort across institutions to do so. Right, maybe anyone could, there are some more questions here, if anyone else wants to add anyone to the question of Barry Clark. All right, let me just try to navigate this, sorry. We have from Sir Paleo, can we blame the small-mindedness of ASEAN states, or the Philippines, and the lack of any active steps on the West Philippine Sea? Oh, this is for Mads. We can we blame the small-mindedness of ASEAN states or the Philippines and the lack of any active steps on the West Philippine Sea or South China Sea claims? Is the question.
It's actually a very pointed question. Actually, that's right. Now, as far as the West Philippine Sea or South China Sea, or military, or naval or marine confrontation about that, there are at least three ways to think about it. In the imbalance of power, matter, it's not really a matter of small-mindedness, it's just a matter of small versus large. The Philippines has a small military, the Chinese have a large one, but the point is that it's not really an issue of whether or not people will fight over it. It's about what drives the necessity for military confrontation in the South China Sea. Now, there's one thing that most Filipinos probably don't know about Chinese deployment in the South China Sea. Military deployment, planes or ships or both, by the Chinese always corresponds to some sort of political shift within the Communist Party. Ever since, well, ever since the 1970s, I've done research on the matter, and any disagreement or any need for a show of force within Beijing will eventually need the dominant regime in Beijing to show some sort of military might. And the most convenient deployment area is the South China Sea. So it's not really so much that the Chinese want to show off to its neighbors. It's not that. It's mainly that the Communist Party likes to show that it is fully in control of the military that it can deploy. Now, it's not this kind of information is not easily. It can be found online, even it can be found. You look hard enough, it will be found. But because of the well, shall we say, the intensity of politicking in the Philippines, the media, the government like to show that it's a matter of a large state showing off towards a small state. When in fact, we can say that the Chinese themselves are being small-minded about it, using overseas military deployment as a form of loyalty control to their own cadres within Beijing. And I'd say that's probably the same thing that happens in the Philippines itself. The deployment of the military across borders or within the Philippine state is a show of force by the national government that it is fully in control of the military it's supposed to command. The reason for that is that between 1986 and 1991, several military coups very nearly took control of the Philippine state. So it's on the surface, I suppose, it looks as if you've got the squabbling politicians in the Philippines wanting to have a solidarity against the Chinese, but it's, I'd say, a kind of a narrow view of politics where it is the local politics that drives international military deployments.
All right, thank you. I hope that answers the question. We have another question here. Anyone among the editors or authors, how do you see IRIS as a field developing in Philippine universities in the next 10 years? Something we brought up during some of the interviews we've had. Nasif is here.
Yes, I think we have authors who are chair of International Studies Department.
That's
probably.
right.
And then Harvey can probably provide his insights. Harvey?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we
Okay.
can hear you.
Yeah. Sorry, my connection is not very good. So the question is about the future of ISIR in the country. Um, my answer, I think, I have to be ambivalent here, though we see that there is hope. For one, because I think really FISO is leading the way to decolonize the international relations, to decolonize the international, and even that I think we will influence other disciplines. The problem really as
Hello, Harvey.
Hello. Have we lost him?
I think it got disconnected.
All right. We also have someone who's written a chapter while we wait for Harvey on internet prospects of international studies in the Philippines. Is Adonis here? Is he here? Sorry, I'm trying to look into the chat. I'd like to answer the question, or any one of the authors can just pitch in. It's hard for me to see if.
How about for you, Brian? I think Brian has also more extensive experiences since he's been teaching in many various international studies departments across Metro Manila. What are your insights about the question posed by Ramel, Brian? Brian, you're unmute? Please unmute your.
Hello, hello. I'm Brian. So I think the future of decolonization among international
No,
studies,
no,
or even
IR,
sorry,
IR, the future of IR in general.
the future of
In the
iron in the
in the
Yes,
Philippines.
next 10 years.
yes, yes. In the next 10 years.
I think it's booming. It's expanding. Especially,
Mm.
I'm looking on the practical sense that more and more students are studying abroad. That they choose to study and to apply scholarships abroad, instead of studying here in the Philippines. So I think it's booming that they gain more perspectives from different academics from abroad, whether they will integrate in their personal research those mainstream IR theories, or whether they will obtain those decolonial or those other global south or non-Western perspectives. I think it's booming and expanding.
Yes, we also noticed that there have been many programs that have opened in the last few years since the book was conceived, and that's a sign that the field is certainly growing. Have we gotten Harvey back, actually? Harvey, are you back? Or Adonis, are you here? If not, then maybe we can move on to the next question. Is actually a comment from, wait, let me see. Colleen Torres. I would like to share my thoughts about the sharings and some questions. Maybe just very quickly, you can. There's no particular question though, so we hope for questions.
Thank you, Ms. Cruz. I hope that I'm audible for
Yep.
everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Ms. Colleen Torres from Cagayan de Oro City in Liceo de Cagayan University. And we were also the convener of the Mindanao International Studies Society Convention this school year. So in relation to the sharings, firstly, I would like to thank the Professor Peleo for sharing his thoughts about small statism. Firstly, I was quite, I really like the point that there's a form of defiance inherent in the Filipino national identity. Considering that Filipinos do have an attitude of being very deviant towards authority sometimes, and I realized that that is already a part of who we are, because on a personal level, I myself have a tendency to also be defiant when I feel like my rights are not being respected in a way as a person in general. Secondly, but I realized that that's might be part of being a Filipino. Second is that I do also agree on IS being too westernized. So in a way, it would be good to challenge some Western-centric scholarship, and also the sharing of Dr. Chong about violence. So, however, challenging violence in general as well, that we shouldn't be too violent. Violence for violence isn't good as well. Then, for a question, I'm just looking through my notes. So, firstly, I wanted to ask about, well, in general, this would be, maybe I'll just go to the topical question. So firstly, in relation to projects on gender, this is for Professor Capistrano, because currently we are teaching gender and society in our school, and I was actually thinking about including a gender project for my students. What would be a good, I was actually interested in networking with some NGOs to actually implement a much needed project on either trafficking or just sex education, just to to raise the level of awareness of young people about these issues, so that they would not become victims of trafficking or pornography, or being victims of pedophilia, because there are cases of that in Mindanao and in our city. So I wanted to ask Dr. Capistrano, if she has any suggestions on projects for gender in general. What are some needed projects on gender that we can do? Maybe just like mobile projects, because it is the pandemic, there is still a quarantine going on. So what we can do at home, maybe is that awareness raising on these issues. So that's my first question. Second would be in terms of publishing. So I really appreciated the book, and I'm also considering buying one for my own library and for referring it to other academics, because we have a network here in Mindanao, and I'm sure that FISO also is aware of the MISS, but this is student-led, although I think MISS, that is already a consortium of IS universities in Zamboanga, in Davao, in Marawi, and in Cagayan de Oro. So how difficult is it to get published in terms of being published in Routledge, for example, because being like first-time authors, what would be your advice? So that's all. Thank you.
All right, Archil, would you like to address the question?
Yes, as far as the NGOs, you can check out the Children's Legal Bureau in your very own backyard in Mindanao. You have Balaod Mindanao, and you could also check out the Child Rights Network. They have already branched in the Asia Pacific. That used to be the Child's NGO Network, which periodically provides alternative reports on the trafficking in persons. Now, as far as gender projects are concerned, we could start by probably looking at our very own homes, because that's the problem with online child sexual exploitation. It's a liquid problem. It happens in the privacy of the homes, with the families actually doing the human rights violations against the children. And it's very difficult, especially in this day and age of the pandemic. A lot of people are locked down. A lot of people are financially challenged. So we can expect a lot of, and with technology, with the internet, the webcam, the families can, as they do, especially Cebu is known as an epicenter, they could actually exploit their very own children using the webcam, using technology. So we could probably look at helplines. There are actually hotlines to report the ongoing sexual exploitation of children. We also have the PCAC, so it's the Philippine Internet Crimes Against Children Center, recently established, just like it was in February of 2019. So you could coordinate efforts there as well, so that there can be certain initiatives that you can start from your very own home. Thank you very much for the question. And I would also like to acknowledge Patrick Dave Bugarin, who is also among the contributing authors. He is into securitization. So yeah, he could probably field in some points about security. So thank you very much.
I think the next question that was asked was about getting published tips for publishing. I think that if I understood that correctly, for those who wish to get into research publications.
Yes, I think that for novice scholars who would like to get into publishing, it is really a part of the program, of your graduate program. If you're a graduate student, it's all about mentorship, or even in the academe, junior faculty being mentored by senior faculty. So it is up to you if you want to have a co-authored publication with your senior mentors. That's one thing. The second thing, if there are available research funding, that will really cultivate and also help and aid your research provided by your institution. Third, conferences is also very significant in this venture, because through conferences and also through your contacts, you can get in touch with commissioning editors who are present during the conference proper at the book exhibit. Usually these commissioning editors are there to scout for those people who would like to publish in their academic presses. But I think Frankie can say more things about mentorship program and other publication ventures within University of the Philippines experience. What do you think, Frankie?
I do think there are fledgling efforts at UP. The issue with UP is that every sort of college has its own autonomy in a way and to make decisions. So there are graduate student conferences, for example, and that is one way of encouraging those enrolled in postgraduate programs to get their research out there, because it's kind of sad when you write or you spend a lot of time writing something and it doesn't get out there. The knowledge that you produce, the conversation you have with other academics does not get out into the world, and you end up having the conversation with yourself and your teacher. And I think that this might be a good idea. There are other professional organizations that have been doing this. In FISO, for one, we try to encourage junior panels, and these panels may consist of students, right? And this is not often done in many conferences. And that's one way of getting them in touch with those who have a lot of experience in publishing. Other initiatives are the journals themselves. I think each college does try to convince younger faculty, for example, to publish in a journal. And there are incentives that are given. They're mostly financial for those who want to take up research. They include deloading, for example, and I do think that that's something that the Philippine educational system does have to improve on, deloading, because you do need time to do these things. And they also have awards for publications in my particular setting. So if you do get published by an international publisher, there is a monetary reward which you have to apply for. And in other universities as well, I hear that they have been making publications part of PhD and master's programs. So there are some private universities that require a publication in the master's level, although I must say a lot of professors themselves or instructors have not yet published, right? So that is something that we have to work on collectively in the Philippines, that there has to be teacher training, there has to be a drive towards research and publication in general, and also investment in R&D. Because I do believe that in the humanities and social sciences, it is a question of funding, right? And a lot of the funding goes towards more technically oriented courses, such as engineering, because the profit and the materiality of those things are clear, right? The patents and things like that. For the social sciences and humanities, they usually want some kind of policy, which is not a bad thing in itself, but it is also somewhat of a hindrance to things like critical theory or historical-based research. And that's something that academics probably have to lobby for, right? Funding and interest in those fields.
Also,
I
I'd
do
like
hope
to
that
get,
answers. Yeah.
yes, I also like to get the insights of Amador and Aliyah, independent researchers. So what are your views? You have no access to institutional support in publishing. Yeah, Aliyah, what do you think, Aliyah, as independent scholar with no institutional support?
Hello, can you hear me? Yes.
Yes, yes.
Okay. So me being not from Philippines, I'm originally from Kazakhstan, and because of that, having international experience and in England and with the Americans and generally with different academia in Kazakhstan and also in Philippines and in Taiwan more recently, I think there's a lot actually depends on the person himself, herself. So you can learn from your mentors, from your professors, but at the same time, I think the individual effort rather than institutional effort often means more, because of course institutions can limit you, especially young people, because they're more important and more powerful professors with probably bigger budgets and bigger networks and bigger connections that they have with other more powerful institutions. But if you're a young researcher, for me, the publications was mostly through conferences first. You meet other professors and publishers, but also you try yourself, because even if you don't succeed in the first attempt, there will be other attempts. And even the attempts that I didn't succeed in the beginning, it often was so that it was a good lesson. So I knew more how to do the next time. So I would just encourage younger junior researchers, if you have ideas, write them up and submit to journals, submit to conferences. Submitting to conferences often helps to refine ideas and make them better for journals. Journal articles, but generally try. Don't wait until someone tells you to do something. Then it might never happen, and might happen when you're already probably over 50 or 60 years old. So in other words, don't wait. Just do it. That's from my experience. Thank you.
Right. It's been my experience that the most important thing for publication is for getting published, even by people who are not immediately associated with one or the other institution, is having very high quality information, high quality data. Now, the Philippines is full of, it's full to the seams with NGOs of one sort or the other that do research on one sort or the other topic that are typically connected internationally. And these organizations, even cities themselves, are sitting on so much data. So if it's possible for a researcher to have access to well, things that are connected, for example, to food security, or in the case now, COVID, obviously, goodness me, this is an international topic, even if it feels the problems are very, very local. That's highly researchable as well. Things like women's rights, children's rights, gender rights. There's so much work done by so many NGOs, but this work is done mainly for their own purposes. If it's possible to get access to the data and generate some kind of research based on that, you'll find that there are so many venues for it. Conferences, well, international conferences would be possible to attend, assuming that the COVID becomes better managed around the world. There are journals that are not necessarily in paper form. There are online journals as well. Journals that are pay to play. Well, that's not really a nice way to put it. Which are peer reviewed, but which publishers people pay to be published. That's one way as well. Numerous ways. I know it's actually a little difficult now to think about all of these things, but eventually the pandemic will pass, and it would be nice for people to have something publishable at the end of it, so that scholarship, international scholarship from the Philippines can continue.
Thank you so much, Amador. Would it be okay if we were to end the panel discussion and QA at this point?
All right.
And maybe take other questions offline after this. Would that be okay?
Yep. I think
Great.
that's fine. We have a few additional questions. You can send these questions to us at contact@fiso.org, for example, and we can disseminate them to the authors if you would like to approach a particular author. All right. So I think we can move to the closing.
Yes, thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much, Frankie, for helping to moderate the panel discussion. I would like to pass the time over to Igor for the closing remarks.
Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, yes, we can.
I will try to turn on my camera. If it doesn't work, I will turn it on, okay?
Yes,
Can
it's
you
showing.
hear me?
Yes,
Can
yes,
you
it's
now
showing.
hear me? Okay. Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone. It is a great pleasure to be able to participate and present my greetings and closing remarks in this wonderful event, the first ever virtual book launch I attended. Launch of the new book dedicated to international studies in the Philippines with a promising subtitle, Mapping New Frontiers in Theory and Practice, edited by Francis Cruz and Nassef Adion. It is no secret that the theorization of international relations has a long history behind, that it was largely built based on Western traditions of political thought, and perhaps only in recent times, several scholarly studies have emphasized the role of place, location, local culture, and knowledge, and various backgrounds of international relations. The question of why we are now so focused in international relations on juxtaposition of Western IR theories with non-Western traditions, political traditions and thought is a question that in itself deserves attention. It is perhaps because the world, and particularly world politics today, becomes increasingly complex, multipolar and uncertain, that competing or contrasting IR theories may be the only way to seek for alternative explanations and solutions to the most pressing issues facing contemporary international relations. On the other hand, for too long, the work of non-Western scholars has been unacknowledged and unrepresented in the discipline. Today, we are celebrating the new book, combining 15 chapters, including the introduction and conclusion, which highlight different aspects of the Philippines' political traditions, thoughts, development, and agency. I haven't read the book completely yet because I just recently received the book, but I already know that this is an important book because it additionally shows that IR has no boundaries in terms of ontology, epistemology, and methodology, neither as a discipline nor as scholarship. In closing, I would like to acknowledge the work of the editors, Francis Cruz and Nassef Adion, and all the authors for their contributions to the discipline, diversity of scholarly voices, and multiple foundations of IR. My sincere congratulations and thank you for the invitation. Well done. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aigo. And I would just like to share my screen to share with you the discount code that we have, which is running for 3 months. Just let me share the slides and then we will end the launch.
That's what you get for staying until the end of the presentation.
Okay, can everyone see the screen?
Yes.
Great. So you can actually visit the, I'll send the link in the chat box. Maybe let me just do that now so it's easier. And okay, so just visit the link that I've sent, and we are offering a 30% discount valid for 3 months. And so you just have to, when you check out the book, you just enter the code IP30, capital letters, and it will automatically apply the code for you, and you can redeem this special discount. Okay. And with that, if there's any more information that you're looking for or any other things that you'd like to check with us, please do feel free to get in touch. And for the questions that we were not able to take today, please do direct it to us. We will get in touch with the editors and contributors to get back to you. With that, is there any other comments from Nasib? If not, we can end the session.
None for me. Thank you. Thank you everyone for attending this first virtual book launch hosted by Routledge. Thank you, Barry. Thank you, Christy. Thank you, Jasmine. Thank you, Simon. Also, Simon is here, and also to Frankie and to all contributors of the book. Thank you so much. We hope that you learned something, and if some questions were not discussed, you can send those questions to the FISO website at contact@fiso.org, and we will send those questions to the contributors. How about you, Frank? Do you have any parting ways to say something?
Sorry?
Any thank you message, Frankie?
Oh, sorry, my mic was... thank you everyone for coming. I'm very glad that you were able to make time in probably your busy schedule of webinars to come here. I do recommend that if you are interested in any of the chapters or themes that we've talked about here, that you approach the authors or you buy our book. I'd like to acknowledge Routledge as well for organizing this webinar of this book launch, and the editors and authors who have appeared here and our supporters and advisors, as well as those who attended out of their pure interest in our book. And I do hope you recommend it to your students and libraries. That's all. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Yes,
Thank you.
Bye.
Very good. Bye-bye.
Stay safe, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.